Thank you, Kanzi. Yes, just to reiterate, friendly rivals. We did play quite a few times actually. I think in a couple of year period on the PSA, or might have been, I think it was WSA back then. We'll cover that in a little bit. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. And I've just been listening to Alex beforehand. That was really interesting. So hopefully I'm not going to repeat too much of what he's said, and I'm going to give you a little overview on the growth of particularly the women's professional game. That's more my forte than the participation side, but there's some people to follow, I believe, on the participation side later on in the summit. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Okay, fantastic. So Kanzi's already given me a bit of an introduction there, but for those of you who don't know me, like she said, I'm highest world ranking of 5, but currently world number 6. I've been playing on the tour for almost 10 years full time now, since I graduated from university in my very sporting degree of engineering and business studies. Which I maybe will use post-career, but not used much yet. But as well, I have been the PSA Women's President since December 2019. Before that was Jenny Duncalf, who did a great job and is a great ambassador for the sport. But she decided it was time to retire, so someone had to take over, and I took that mantle over from her. So to start with, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what the kind of timeline of women's professional squash over the years, and some of the challenges that have been faced along. Then I'll talk a little bit about the current position of women's squash and squash in general on the professional side, and then maybe have a look at some of the challenges that we're going to face in the future or could face. Okay, so excuse me. Here you can see a timeline, and as you see on the left, we've got Whisper started in 1983. So there was obviously women's squash before this, but this was the start of the actual professional association. So Women's International Squash Players Association there started in 1983. So quite a few years ago now, but definitely. I think the men's was definitely started before, so a little bit late to the party on that one, but yeah, we're still building that from now. So 2011, I think there was quite a bit of change. Understandable for general public who may get interested in squash, but also the squash fans who are watching it already. So in 2011, Whisper became the WSA, so Women's Squash Association. And I remember that time quite clearly, because I was actually, little tidbit for you, I was the last winner of a Whisper title, which was also my first professional title. It was a 5K event in deepest, darkest Derbyshire in the UK, and I played Tanya Bailey in the final. So that's quite a memorable time for me personally. So yeah, I was the last person to win one of those titles. After that time, I think the challenges that I've listed at the bottom became really apparent to a lot of the players as well, and I think they were being brought up in other sports, and as well as these challenges at the bottom, there's a feeling that the tour, the women's side of the tour particularly, was starting to stagnate, and weren't getting new events on, losing some traditional events, as well as not pushing the prize money up at all. So I think something to really note on those challenges is, because they were separate associations, there was a big disconnect between the men's and the women's tours, and that led to that included, sorry, a big lack of equality, including the big prize money disparity. And there was a handful of events that were held together. Most of them were separate events from separate tours, but there was a few, British Open, US Open, those kind of events that were actually held together, but there was a big disparity in the prize money, which obviously the women were not pleased with at all. And I think there was some big challenges. The WSA was a very small organisation, and therefore had really limited resources and a limited product to offer, and limited resources to go out and expertise to go out and seek outside sponsorship and get the sport to grow on the women's side in that way. And all of these kind of just led to a limited earning potential for the women to play full-time squash. And I think that's one of the key things. The more players you can get playing full-time and able to make a living from it and commit themselves solely to that, you see the standard driven up, whether it's been in squash or women's football, or any sport where you've seen that happen. So that was really limited at that time, and there was a kind of feeling amongst a lot of the women players that the women's side of the tour had stagnated a lot, and they weren't happy with where it was going as well. But actually, during this time, you'll see in 2013, excuse me, the US Open, one of the few joint events at the time, made a big step and became the first tournament to offer equal prize money to both the men and the women. And that was really pushed for, I think, by US Squash, but also from their sponsors' perspective. I believe it was Delaware Investments at the time, as I think the US have been at the forefront of pushing to close that gender pay gap, and that was a big step in that direction. But you see, it didn't become across the board for a few years after that. Carrying on with I think the dissatisfaction amongst the women's players in the direction of the tour, the PSA were also keen to bring the WSA on board and become a joint tour. The PSA had created Squash TV in I think 2011, 2012, and they were really keen to. They realised from negotiations with broadcasters and also with WSA that it was really imperative to become one body, to have all the rights together, make everything simpler and things like that. So we'll cover that a little bit more in a minute. But you can see by 2015, March 2015 is actually when the merger went through, and WSA and PSA merged to just become PSA. And this, when it came down to it, the vote by both the women's and the men's players was very highly in favour of the merger. I think everybody, the majority of players, realised how important it was to the sport and would be imperative to the growth going forward. That same year, the tin changed for the women down to 17-inch tin, which was really important as well, because this was the last playing difference between the men and the women. So we're already playing the same scoring system, already playing on the same court, already playing the same amount of games, already playing the same amount of rounds in the tournament. That was the one change that needed to be made, so that it was across the board equal on the actual playing conditions. And there was definitely some hesitation about this from various angles, people thinking that the matches would become too short and that the women's physicality wouldn't be able to cope with the increased physical demand. But from my perspective, at least since then, I think the women's game has become a lot more attacking and therefore a lot more exciting, and actually able to show off better angles that the lower tin creates, and also the insane athleticism of so many of our female players. So I think, although obviously there's always going to be resistance to change. I think that one has been a resounding success. Then quickly, 2017, equal prize money was brought in across all the platinum events on the PSA World Tour. And we'll touch on that in a minute as well, with how the kind of strategy behind how we could make that possible and not just take away from the men's tour. And then, as you'll see, just last year, the kind of last rule was changed, which differed between the men's and the women's tours. They had slightly different seeding systems for the platinum events, and in essence, the women were seeding 1 and 2 players. So in the last 32, you'd always have a top 16 player seeded to play a non-top 16 player. Whereas in the men's, they had just the top 8 seeded. So in the last 32, the top 8 couldn't meet each other, but they could play anybody else, and so forth. So I think that there's pros and cons. There was definitely pros and cons for both, but the main issue was that they were different. And so that was the kind of last step in changing that. So you've also seen some really great second round matchups and things now, which promoters are able to push before the tournament and sell more tickets for earlier rounds as well, which is fantastic. And at the end there, total prize money equality. Whether it'll ever happen, I'd like to think one day maybe, but in reality, probably not. But I think it's something that needs to be continued to be strived for, even if it's never actually going to be reached, because it's so important that you continue to try and close that gap. Right, next one. Okay, so I've just got a table here. The top ones there on the left there are all of the women's stats. So this is just real tangible data for you to see how the merger has impacted both sides of the tour. So we've gone with 13-14 was the last season before the merger. We've gone with 18-19 because it was the most recent season not affected by COVID. And as you can see, huge increases in the amount of women's events on the tour, up nearly 70%, prize money up over $1 million in that time, 65.7%, huge increase in members as well, and even more since then, which is just fantastic. And even the earnings of the top 10 players has gone up nearly 80%. And as I touched on before, the amount of players that are able to play full time and commit themselves fully to squash and make a living solely from playing is definitely a lot more now. And you see that in the amount of players competing at tournaments and the depth of competition. Absolutely. And then if we skip down to the bottom for a second, these are the men's stats. So as I touched on before, we wanted to make sure that you don't want to take money away from one side to give it to the other side. You want to actually push everything up. And as you can see, the men's tour, although the percentages aren't as high, the starting points were a lot higher. So actually the men's, the prize money still increased over $1 million, still a huge increase over that 5-year period, and the events also up over 100 events in that time. So the events wise, the tour's in a really positive growth state. And then as you can see in the middle there, the PSA turnover in that time is up over 200%. And a lot of that is down to having the joint tours and allowing PSA to use a strategy to take more ownership of those bigger events and push in the directions they want to push and have that leverage from having both sides of the tour and full control of that. So you can see that's huge increases over that time, which I can easily say would not have happened, particularly on the women's side, without the merger. Obviously, there was going to be positives and potential negatives for the merger. As I've already touched on again, the positives, there was an improved product, aligned strategy, leadership, across the whole tour, and also leverage for negotiations. And by this, I kind of mean you've got one product to sell, whether it's for broadcast or sponsorship, but then also all of the promoters only have to deal with one association, one set of rules, one set of contracts, potentially everything like that, and that really builds up and adds up over the course of seasons. So it's invaluable. Also, being able to have united front for pushing for equal prize money, for for all the media marketing campaigns, and also for the things like the PSA Foundation campaigns and things like that. Just having everyone behind that adds a lot more balance and a lot more drive. There obviously was some potential negatives as well. I think from the male side, there was a potential to feel like the money that was being put into the women's side of the game to close that gap could have been put into their events instead. But I think it's, from the stats on the previous page, you can see it's definitely their prize money's increased by just as much as well, actually. So that gap needs to be made smaller. It's not the women certainly haven't overtaken the men in prize money at all. And I think their prize money hasn't gone down in any of those events either. So I think that's a really important point. And for the female players, I think the main concern was that obviously the PSA was a bigger organization, more players, more tournaments, everything like that. So they didn't want to get lost in that and feel like their interests weren't going to be looked after. And again, I think it can definitely be reiterated the importance that PSA has put on growing the women's game and how important that is to the sport overall. It can't just focus on the men's game. And so I think the players, those were the potential pitfalls, but I think the players will agree that they haven't actually come into fruition, which is good. And just at the bottom there, I think leadership were hyper aware of the need to use the amalgamation of resources, increase relationships and vision to leverage that increase in prize money across the tour, including those flagship events, and not just reallocate it from current budgets. As I said, none of the events actually dropped in prize money, so that was definitely achieved. So where are we now? So I think it's kind of universally agreed that there's a real buzz around women's squash and how high the standard is at the moment. And as I said, that low tin has made it really attacking, and also the Egyptian way of playing squash is generally pretty attacking. Mine too, I think. But that's made for some real high quality matches, and also the athleticism, just going from strength to strength, and you're seeing that then become ultra competitive. It's not the same player winning all the tournaments, and I think that's really good for the sport. As I've already said, we've got more players than ever, more events than ever, and as Alex touched on in the last one, we've got much more aligned strategy, much more. I think we've built on a basic strategy, now able to really push on, but also look to partner more and work more closely with WSF on that, as squash as a whole. Improve resources. So you've already got the amalgamation of the WSA and the PSA's resources, but then as the turnovers increased and everything like that, I think PSA's really looked to build its in-house resources and expertise, but then look to see where it has gaps and where it needs to bring outside expertise in as well, which is where we come to Infront, which Alex also touched on before, to create that disruption that's necessary to maximize, get some growth that's much higher than the natural growth of the tour would be otherwise. So hopefully when I come back to the summit in 5 years' time, those next block of figures are going to be even higher percentages. And then obviously we can't ignore COVID, and that particularly brings participation challenges. And Kanzi mentioned before about the We Are One Fund and how so many players would have had to have stopped playing or would have had to consider stopping playing, and some unfortunately I'm sure have. But if we can keep using that We Are One Fund, building funds to help those players carry on playing, that's going to make a huge difference, not just to them, but to the tour as a whole over the next 5 years as well. And over $100,000 has gone out on to players through the We Are One Fund. But now we need to really try and keep fundraising for that to keep those players possible. The amounts they're getting are not huge, but they're necessary, like Kanzi said, to pay their bills and even food. So please help at all if you can with that. It's great. We're extremely grateful for all that help, and the players, and you speak to the ones that have received the help, and they couldn't be more grateful about the possibility of being able to carry on playing squash. And lastly, like moving forward, so there's a lot of I've put a lot of challenges here. I try to think quite broadly and speak to quite a few people here, and there's a lot of challenges in the sport landscape in general coming back from COVID, and it's going to be hard to compete with those mainstream sports that are going to have so much focus: football, tennis, those real big golf, those real big sports, and it's something we've always competed in, but I think it's going to be I've competed for with that space, but I think it's going to be even more difficult then. I think you can't ignore the fact that women's sport has been harder hit than men's as well. Unfortunately, in the news at the moment, the general sports news is the men's competition will go ahead and the women's competition has been postponed or cancelled. And I'm very thankful to be part of a sport where in squash that's not even a thought process, and that's where we need to definitely build, but we need to really recognize that the women's side's definitely been hit harder than the men's on all fronts, including squash. I'm not going to go through every point, but I think participation is a huge challenge for squash already, and especially now we've had COVID, and a lot of people have got out of routine of exercising, and they found other methods of exercise and things like that, and so we're going to have to really challenge that. Perceptions, we've long unfortunately had this elitist tag in a lot of countries, a lot of areas, and we need to really challenge that and look at the changing demographic of squash. We need to bring the younger players in and keep them there. I think what I want to touch on as well, back into the participation, about perceptions and education, particularly on the women's side. And I think it's becoming increasingly aware of how important it is to educate young girls and break their perceptions on what they believe about sport and things like body image. Talking openly about things like menstrual cycles is really important, because a lot of girls stop exercising because they don't know, they don't have the information. Also, they don't think it's the perception. It's not good to sweat and things like that. So we need to break these perceptions and put that education out there for girls to have the confidence to compete in whatever sport they want and do whatever they want. I think as well, the role models one's really important. You've got to see it to be it, and that links up with the regional diversity as well. We've got more women playing, but we need more diversity, more countries, more players coming from every region. And I think that the more people can see someone that is like them doing something, the more likely they are to think they can do it. I think that's it's a much broader issue, but it's something that's definitely impacting women's squash, and is something that we needs to be addressed moving forward. And then the last one there, I mean, youth engagement, and it's a digital world now, and Alex talked about as well Infront coming in and using their skills and expertise to digitalize the sport more, build the digital platforms, and then can we get involved in some way in the sort of esports side as well? Who knows? But it's a lot of progress been made in women's squash. There's been huge amounts of growth, and I think these are some of the challenges moving forward. But I'm definitely in a really positive and hopeful state about women's squash moving forward. So I hope you are too. And yeah, that's all from me. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We actually have so many questions in the Q&A section, so this is amazing. Unfortunately, we're only going to have time for a couple of them, but then after the session, if you want to go to the booths, and then people can join you and ask you more questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have a question from Steve, who's actually a referee at England Squash, and he's asking you, do you believe that the lack of professional and female referees is impacting progress within the game?
I don't know if it's impacting progress within the game, but I think it's certainly something that I have noticed, and that needs to be addressed as well. I think refereeing is a very difficult one, and getting more candidates through the system and through the learning process. And I know that with the World Squash Officiating platform that's imminently being launched, there's going to be some more opportunities for that. And it's, again, how do we break the perception that men are referees effectively, and bring more women into it. You do see a few women, but there's definitely, I think, more challenges, and it's historically seen as a bit of a boys' club as well, which can't be ignored. And it's how do we make it more inclusive and more open and welcoming to the women that want to get involved. And we have got some women referees, particularly in the UK, and it needs to be how can we keep those, and how can we get more.
Amazing, thank you so much. And then the second question is, Mira is asking, in your personal experience, how has the culture of the game changed since you started playing with the merger into the PSA?
I think the game has taken a few notches up on the sort of professionalism, and I think more what you're going to be getting going to an event. The levels of I think the level of organisation and everything that is required for those events is much higher. So you're not going to be worrying about whether you can access water or anything like bottles of water or anything like that. So I think that's definitely changed, and I think you've seen that then push the level of the game up too. So I think the culture contested, whereas now I think, like I said, the breadth of the game, the depth of the standard is just on a skyrocket path, and those matches now are as competitive as the men's side. They see it as a professional game now.
Amazing, thank you so much. And last question, this is super hard If you could pick, what would be the best moment of your career? I could never answer this question, so I'm curious to see what you have to say.
I would say winning that 10K against you, Kanzi, but my best moment of my career, I think, well, there's a few. I think my silver medal at the Commonwealth Games was pretty special, and also when I won, I think winning the World Team Championships with England as well was amazingly special. I think a lot of the other players on the team had a lot of mental scars from previous experiences with that, and to win that and almost win it for me and for them was really special. And also the recent Black Ball tournament that I won as well, because I think I've known for a lot of years that I can compete with anyone on my day, but to have that, to find that consistency, and also not to play my best squash throughout the event, but just to find a way to win was incredible, and I was extremely proud of myself for that. So I think they're very different days in my squash careers, but only had one in my squash career, but all equally on a perch at the top.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time. Because we have so many questions, it would be amazing if you can go press the back button to exit the session, so you can go and have a chat with the people there, and you can answer more questions. And then, of course, you're more than welcome to join back for the rest of the conference. Thanks you so much.
Thanks, everyone. I'll be in the lounge.